The bitter Montana winter howled through the streets of Copper Creek like a vengeful spirit, driving the last of the townsfolk indoors as darkness fell. Delilah Dawson stood alone on the platform of the train station, her thin shawl providing little protection against the merciless cold that seemed determined to seep into her very bones. The station master had long since retreated to his office, casting her a pitying glance before locking the door. The train that had brought her here had departed hours ago, taking with it her last connection to the life she'd known. "They said they would be here," she whispered, her words crystallizing in the frigid air. The letter from her aunt and uncle had been clear they would meet her at Copper Creek Station upon her arrival. Yet as the sun dipped below the jagged peaks of the western mountains, Delilah was forced to accept the truth. No one was coming. Her parents' funeral had been only 2 weeks prior, their lives claimed by the influenza that had swept through St. Louis. At 22, Delilah had found herself alone, with nothing but debts and memories. When her father's brother had written offering her a place in their Montana home, it had seemed like Providence. Now, as she huddled against her single trunk, watching the snow begin to fall, that letter felt more like cruel deception, a horse's whinny cut through the howl of the wind. Delilah lifted her gaze to see a tall figure on horseback approaching the station. The rider wore a heavy sheepskin coat, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low against the wind, the silhouette unmistakably that of a working cowboy. He dismounted with fluid grace, tethering his horse before approaching the platform. In the fading light she could see his features, a strong jawline darkened with stubble, eyes the color of a summer sky, and a mouth set in a concerned line. "Madam," he called, his voice carrying above the wind. "Station's closed for the night. You waiting on someone? They aren't coming," Delilah replied, her voice breaking slightly. She hadn't meant to speak the thought aloud, but exhaustion and cold had worn away her composure. The stranger ascended the steps, moving with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to harsh elements. Up close, she guessed him to be perhaps 28, with creases at the corners of his eyes that spoke of squinting against the prairie sun. "The Dawsons," she explained, gathering her dignity. "My Uncle Thomas Dawson and his wife. They were to meet me. I'm Delilah Dawson." Recognition flickered across his face. "Thomas Dawson's place is 20 miles north. Been empty for near 2 months now. They pulled up stakes and headed for Oregon Territory after selling their claim." The words struck her like physical blows. "That can't be right. I received their letter only 3 weeks ago. They invited me to come live with them after my parents." She couldn't finish the sentence. The cowboy's expression softened. "I'm sorry, Miss Dawson. The stage to Helena doesn't run again until Wednesday, and there's no hotel in Copper Creek proper." Delilah felt the cold certainty of her situation settling over her. Her meager funds would not stretch to a return ticket to St. Louis, even if she had something to return to. Her family had left her, quite literally, in the cold. "I don't know what to do," she admitted, hating the tremor in her voice. The cowboy studied her for a long moment, then seemed to come to a decision. He removed his hat, revealing thick chestnut hair. "Name's Matthew Weston. I foreman at the Circle W, my father's ranch about 5 miles west. We've got a housekeeper there, Mrs. Simmons. Proper as they come. You'd be welcome to shelter with us until you sort matters out." Delilah hesitated. Accepting the invitation of a strange man went against everything she'd been taught about propriety. Yet the alternative was a night in the bitter cold. As if reading her thoughts, Matthew added, "I understand your concern, Miss Dawson. If you prefer, I can see if Pastor Fletcher's wife might take you in. Their place is small, but they're good people." "Why would you help me?" Delilah asked, unable to keep suspicion from her voice. Matthew replaced his hat, adjusting it against the wind. My mother was stranded much like yourself once, before she met my father. She'd never forgive me if I left anyone to face a Montana night without shelter. He paused, then added softly, "Your family left you in the cold, Miss Dawson. I aim to bring you warmth, at least for tonight." Something in his steady gaze convinced Delilah to trust him. "Thank you, Mr. Weston. I accept your offer." Matthew nodded, then hefted her trunk as if it weighed nothing. "Horse's name is Thunder. He's steady in the snow. I'll walk alongside and lead him." Minutes later, Delilah found herself atop the tall buckskin, wrapped in Matthew's heavy coat, despite his protests that he was used to the cold. They moved slowly through the thickening snow, Matthew leading the horse with a sure hand, occasionally pointing out landmarks hidden by darkness and weather. "Been working this land since I was 14, he explained as they traveled. "My father built the Circle W from nothing after the war. Started with just 20 head of cattle and a broken-down cabin. Now we run 2,000 head and employ 15 men year-round." "It sounds impressive," Delilah replied, finding comfort in conversation that distracted from her predicament. "My father was a bookkeeper for a shipping company." "I was raised to manage accounts, not cattle," Matthew chuckled. "Out here, everyone learns a bit of everything. Mrs. Simmons will like having another woman around. My father's been widowed 10 years now, and the house could use a woman's touch." "I don't wish to impose longer than necessary," Delilah said quickly. "Once I determine what became of my relatives, we'll sort that out," Matthew interrupted gently. "Montana has a way of testing newcomers, Miss Dawson, but it rewards those who persevere." The storm intensified as they traveled, transforming the landscape into a swirling white void. Delilah lost all sense of direction, trusting completely in Matthew's guidance. Finally, orange light pierced the darkness, windows glowing through the snow. "Circle W," Matthew announced with evident pride. "Not much to look at in this weather, but it's home." As they drew closer, Delilah made out a substantial 2-story house built of sturdy logs, with a wide porch wrapping around the front. Outbuildings loomed as darker shapes in the surrounding whiteness. Matthew helped her dismount, supporting her with strong hands when her stiff legs nearly buckled. The front door burst open before they reached it, spilling light onto the snow. A tall, broad-shouldered man with silver-streaked hair stood framed in the doorway. "Matt was about to send the boys out looking for you," the man called. Then, noticing Delilah, "Who have you brought home, son?" "Father, this is Miss Delilah Dawson," Matthew explained as he guided her up the steps. "Miss Dawson, my father, James Weston." "Sir," Delilah managed through chattering teeth. James Weston's weathered face registered surprise, then concern. "Thomas Dawson's kin. Thought they'd all headed west." "Apparently not all were informed of that decision," Matthew replied with quiet significance. Understanding crossed the older man's face. "Well, you're welcome here, Miss Dawson. Come in before you freeze solid." The interior of the Weston home was surprisingly refined for a frontier ranch house. A massive stone fireplace dominated the main room, its crackling flames casting dancing light over sturdy furniture. Colorful woven rugs covered wide plank floors, and kerosene lamps cast a warm glow from tables and wall brackets. A plump, gray-haired woman emerged from what Delilah assumed was the kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron. "Land sakes, what have you brought in from the cold, Matthew Weston?" "Mrs. Simmons, this is Miss Dawson. She needs shelter and hospitality." The housekeeper assessed Delilah with kind but shrewd eyes. "Poor thing's half frozen. Come along, dear. We'll get you warmed up and fed." The next hour passed in a blur for Delilah. Mrs. Simmons ushered her to a bedroom with a crackling fire already lit in the small fireplace. The housekeeper helped her change into a borrowed nightgown and robe, tutting over how thin her traveling clothes were for Montana weather. Seated by the fire with her hair down to dry and her feet in a basin of warm water, Delilah felt sensation painfully returning to her extremities. "The Westons are good men," Mrs. Simmons said as she placed a tray of steaming soup and bread on a small table beside Delilah. "Old Mr. Weston's gruff but fair, and young Matthew, he's got his mother's heart. She was a fine lady, God rest her soul." "I'm very grateful," Delilah murmured. "I don't know what I would have done if Mr. Weston hadn't come along." Mrs. Simmons patted her shoulder. "Providence, dear. The good Lord sends help when we need it most." She moved toward the door. "Rest now. We'll sort everything out in the morning." Left alone, Delilah ate the simple but delicious meal, then crawled between the warm flannel sheets of the bed. Despite the turbulence of the day, exhaustion claimed her quickly. The last sound she registered being the howl of the wind outside contrasted with the protective crackling of the fire within. Morning brought clarity in more ways than one. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape transformed by snow that sparkled like diamond dust under a brilliant blue sky. Delilah dressed in her own clothes, which Mrs. Simmons had kindly pressed for her, and made her way downstairs. She found the Weston men at the breakfast table, both rising when she entered. Matthew's smile warmed something inside her that had nothing to do with the fire blazing in the hearth. "Miss Dawson," James Weston said, "I hope you slept well." "Very well, thank you, Mr. Weston." "James, please." "And you must call my son Matthew. Formalities don't last long in Montana." Matthew pulled out a chair for her. "Father sent one of the hands into town this morning with a telegram inquiry about your uncle." "That was very thoughtful," Delilah said, accepting the coffee Mrs. Simmons poured for her. James nodded. "Least we could do. In the meantime, you're welcome to stay here as long as needed." "I can't impose nonsense," James interrupted. "Winter's no time to be without shelter in Montana." He glanced at his son. "Besides, Matthew says you've experience with accounts." "I assisted my father, yes. Our regular bookkeeper moved on last month. We could use someone to organize the ledgers until spring at least. Room and board plus a fair wage." Delilah set down her coffee cup. "You're offering me employment if you're willing," James confirmed. "The work's not difficult for someone with training. Just keeping track of expenses, cattle sales, supplies purchased." The offer took Delilah by surprise. She had expected to be treated as a charity case, not offered a position of responsibility. "I would be happy to help, but I've never worked with ranch accounts. Cattle and shipping aren't so different when it comes to figures," James said with a shrug. "Matthew can explain the particulars." Matthew smiled. "Father hates paperwork. He'd rather be out with the herd in a blizzard than sit at a desk for an hour." "True enough," James admitted, rising from the table. "I'll leave you to discuss it. Got men waiting at the barn." He nodded to Delilah. "Welcome to Circle W, Miss Dawson." After James left, Matthew refilled Delilah's coffee cup. "You don't have to accept if you're uncomfortable with the arrangement." "Actually, I'm grateful," Delilah admitted. "I need to earn my way, not be a burden on your kindness." "You wouldn't be a burden," Matthew said quietly. "But I understand pride." He hesitated. "About your uncle, I should tell you that the Dawsons left under something of a cloud. There were debts unpaid in town." Delilah felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. "I had no idea. They wrote that they were prospering." "Some men find it easier to appear successful than to be successful," Matthew observed. "Don't take their actions as a reflection on you." "Thank you for your kindness, but I'm afraid I must. They're family, after all." "Family is more than blood," Matthew said, his eyes holding hers. "It's the people who stand by you when the storm hits." Something in his steady gaze made Delilah's heart flutter in a way that had nothing to do with her uncertain circumstances. She looked away, suddenly aware of how intimate the conversation felt. "Perhaps you could show me the accounts," she suggested, seeking safer ground. Matthew nodded, respecting her retreat. "Of course. The office is just off the main room." The office proved to be a small room dominated by a massive oak desk covered in papers. Shelves lined the walls, filled with ledgers, books, and curious objects that Delilah assumed were keepsakes. "It's a bit of a mess," Matthew admitted, gathering scattered papers. "Johnson, our former bookkeeper, wasn't the most organized man." "I can see that," Delilah replied, already assessing the chaos with a professional eye. "What system did he use for categorizing expenses?" "System," Matthew laughed. "That implies a method. I think he mostly jotted things down and hoped for the best." For the next several hours, Delilah lost herself in the familiar comfort of numbers and ledgers. Matthew proved to be a patient teacher, explaining the ranch operations and answering her questions without condescension. By midday, she had outlined a proper accounting system that clearly impressed him. "You have a gift for this," he remarked as they reviewed her organizational plan. "Just training and experience," Delilah demurred. "My father believed women should understand finances. He said it was the best protection a woman could have." "Wise man, your father," Matthew observed. "Too many women are left vulnerable by ignorance of such matters." "Yes," Delilah agreed softly, thinking of her mother who had known nothing of their financial situation until her husband's death revealed the precariousness of their position. Knowledge is indeed protection. They worked through the afternoon, breaking only when Mrs. Simmons insisted they eat. The domestic rhythm of the ranch house was soothing to Delilah, so different from the crowded city streets she'd known. Even the distant sounds of men working with livestock and the occasional shout carried on the clear air seemed like parts of a well-orchestrated symphony. By evening, Delilah had made considerable progress organizing the chaotic accounts. When she finally set down her pen, her fingers were stained with ink, but her mind was satisfied with the accomplishment. "You've done more in one day than Johnson did in a month," Matthew said appreciatively as he escorted her to the dining room. "I enjoy bringing order to disorder," she admitted. "Numbers make sense. They balance or they don't." "Unlike people," Matthew suggested with a wry smile. "Precisely," Delilah agreed, returning his smile. Dinner was a surprisingly lively affair. Several of the senior ranch hands joined them at the large table, and Delilah found herself included in conversations about cattle, weather, and local gossip. James Weston, gruff but fair as Mrs. Simmons had described, seemed to approve of her work with the accounts. "Matthew says you've already spotted some discrepancies in our supply costs," he commented as he passed her a platter of roasted venison. "Just a few instances where it appears you were charged twice for the same order," Delilah explained. "It's easily corrected." "Money saved is money earned," James declared with satisfaction. "You'll earn your keep here, Miss Dawson." The casual acceptance of her presence at Circle W both comforted and confused Delilah. These people barely knew her, yet they'd welcomed her into their home and work with unexpected ease. It was a stark contrast to the betrayal of her own blood relations. After dinner, while the men retreated to the main room for pipes and conversation, Mrs. Simmons showed Delilah to a small parlor where a pianoforte stood against one wall. "It was the mistress's pride," the housekeeper explained, running a fond hand over the polished wood. "No one's played it properly since she passed." "Do you play, dear?" "A little," Delilah admitted. "Then please give it voice again. It's sad to see it silent." Unable to refuse the kind request, Delilah seated herself at the instrument. The keys were yellowed with age but responded well to her touch. She began with a simple hymn, then moved to a Chopin nocturne that had been her mother's favorite. Lost in the music, she didn't notice Matthew's entrance until the final notes faded. He stood in the doorway, an expression on his face that she couldn't quite interpret. "That was beautiful," he said quietly. Delilah felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I'm rather out of practice. Didn't sound that way to me." He moved into the room, stopping beside the pianoforte. "My mother played that same piece. It was my father's favorite." "I'm sorry if it brought painful memories," Delilah said, beginning to rise. "No," Matthew said quickly, his hand briefly touching her shoulder. "Good memories. The best kind." He withdrew his hand as if suddenly aware of the impropriety. "Father would like to hear you play sometime, if you wouldn't mind." "I would be happy to," Delilah replied, aware of a strange tension between them that had nothing to do with music. Matthew cleared his throat. "I came to tell you that we received a reply to our telegram inquiry about your uncle." Delilah's heart quickened. "What news?" The Dawsons were indeed seen boarding a train for Oregon Territory 6 weeks ago. The station master in Helena remembered them because they paid their fare in silver dollars rather than paper money, apparently uncommon enough to be memorable. The confirmation of her abandonment shouldn't have hurt. She'd already accepted the reality, yet it did. "I see." "I'm sorry," Matthew said, and she could tell he meant it. "People aren't always what we hope them to be." "No," Delilah agreed softly, "but sometimes they're better than we could have imagined." She met his eyes. "Thank you, Matthew, for everything." He held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded. "You're part of Circle W now, Delilah, for as long as you wish to be." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and the sound of it in his deep voice sent an inexplicable shiver through her. "Thank you," she repeated, unable to find more adequate words. "Rest well," he said, then left her alone with the pianoforte and her tumultuous thoughts. The days that followed fell into a pattern that brought Delilah unexpected contentment. Mornings were spent working in the office, organizing accounts and corresponding with suppliers. Afternoons often found her helping Mrs. Simmons with household tasks or exploring the ranch buildings when weather permitted. Evenings were for music, reading, or conversation around the fire. December gave way to January, bringing colder temperatures, but also the bright beauty of winter sunshine on snow-covered plains. Delilah found herself adapting to ranch life with surprising ease. She learned the names and stories of the hands, came to understand the rhythm of cattle ranching even in winter, and discovered a capacity for physical work that her city upbringing had never revealed. More surprising was her growing attachment to the Westons, particularly Matthew. She found herself looking forward to their conversations, valuing his insights, and admiring the quiet strength he brought to every task. He treated her with a respect that acknowledged her capabilities while still offering protection when needed. One particularly frigid morning in late January, Delilah was reviewing the previous year's cattle sales when Matthew burst into the office, his face grave. "3 of our men haven't returned from checking the north pasture fence line," he explained tersely. "They're 6 hours overdue and there's another storm moving in." "How can I help?" Delilah asked immediately. Matthew looked momentarily surprised by her offer, then grateful. "We need every able body. The ranch hands are assembling search parties. If you could help Mrs. Simmons prepare supplies, food, bandages, extra blankets." "Of course," Delilah said, already rising. "Be careful, Matthew." He nodded, then hesitated before adding, "If we're not back by nightfall, Father knows what to do." The gravity of the situation struck her fully then. Men died in Montana winters with alarming regularity. The thought of Matthew lost in the blinding snow sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the temperature. "You'll come back," she said with more confidence than she felt. "I'll pray for you all." For the next few hours, Delilah and Mrs. Simmons worked feverishly to prepare for both the search party and potential casualties. They heated bricks to wrap in flannel for warmth, prepared bandages and salves for frostbite, and stocked saddlebags with jerky and hardtack that wouldn't freeze solid. James Weston himself led one search party, while Matthew headed the other. As they mounted up, Delilah handed Matthew his supplies, their gloved hands touching briefly. "Godspeed," she said softly. His eyes held hers for a heartbeat. "Keep the home fires burning, Delilah." Then they were gone, swallowed by the swirling snow that had begun to fall again. The hours that followed were among the longest of Delilah's life. She and Mrs. Simmons kept vigil by the windows, maintaining fires in every fireplace and preparing hot food that could be served at a moment's notice. The early winter darkness descended, bringing with it wind that howled around the house like a living thing. "They're experienced men," Mrs. Simmons reassured her as they sat by the main room fire, though her constant glances toward the window belied her confident tone. "They know this land better than their own faces." "Yes, of course," Delilah agreed, though fear had settled in her stomach like a stone. She realized with some surprise that her concern was not just for the missing men but specifically for Matthew. The thought of him in danger made her heart constrict in a way that could not be dismissed as mere friendship. Just past 8 o'clock, when the storm was at its fiercest, the sound of horses and men's voices penetrated the howl of the wind. Delilah and Mrs. Simmons rushed to the door in time to see shadowy figures emerging from the whiteout conditions. James Weston entered first, supporting a younger man whose face was alarmingly pale. Behind him came two ranch hands carrying a third between them, the man clearly unconscious. Matthew was the last to enter, his face etched with exhaustion beneath its coating of ice and snow. "Found them trapped in Miller's Gulch," James explained tersely as they helped the injured men toward the fire. "Horse broke through the ice at the crossing. They all went into the water trying to save the beast. Jake here got pulled under, took Matthew diving in to find him." Delilah's gaze flew to Matthew, noting for the first time how his clothes seemed frozen stiff, his lips tinged with blue. Without conscious thought, she moved to him, helping him remove his ice-crusted coat. "You need to get warm," she said, her hands trembling slightly as she worked at the frozen buttons. "Mrs. Simmons has hot water ready for baths." "See to Jake first," Matthew managed through chattering teeth. "He was under longer. Your father and the others are tending him," Delilah assured him. "You'll do him no good if you succumb to the cold yourself." Something in her voice must have convinced him, for he allowed her to lead him upstairs to his room, where Mrs. Simmons had already arranged for hot water to be brought. Delilah knew she should leave him to manage himself, but concern overrode propriety. "Can you manage?" she asked, hovering at the door. Matthew attempted a reassuring smile that failed to mask his exhaustion. "I've weathered worse." "Matthew," her voice was firmer now, "you dove into freezing water to save a man's life. You rode for hours in wet clothes in a blizzard. Please don't dismiss this," he sobered. "I'll be fine, Delilah, truly, but thank you for your concern." Reluctantly, she left him to his privacy, returning downstairs to help with the other injured men. Jake, the most seriously hurt, had regained consciousness but was clearly suffering from severe exposure. The ranch's cook, who served as unofficial doctor, treated him for frostbite while Mrs. Simmons prepared hot broth laced with whiskey. It was nearly midnight before the crisis had passed. Jake and the other injured hand, Tom, had been settled in the bunkhouse under the watchful eye of their fellows. James Weston had finally retired, extracting a promise from Delilah that she would wake him if any man's condition worsened. Exhausted but unable to sleep, Delilah sat by the main room fire, staring into the flames. The day's events had forced her to confront feelings she'd been avoiding acknowledging. The fear she'd felt when Matthew was in danger, the relief at his safe return. These were not the emotions of a temporary employee or even a friend. "You should be resting." Matthew's voice startled her. He stood in the doorway, dressed in dry clothes, his hair still damp from his bath. Some color had returned to his face, though exhaustion still lined his features. "I could say the same to you," Delilah replied, making room for him on the settee before the fire. He joined her, the cushion sinking slightly under his weight. "I wanted to check on you. Today was difficult. For you far more than for me," she pointed out. "You saved Jake's life." Matthew shrugged uncomfortably. "Any of the men would have done the same, perhaps," Delilah conceded. "But that doesn't diminish your courage." They sat in companionable silence for a time, watching the flames dance. Delilah was acutely aware of Matthew beside her, the sound of his breathing, the lingering scent of soap from his bath, the way his hands, strong and capable, rested on his knees. "When you didn't return by sunset," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "I was afraid." Matthew turned to look at her, his expression softening. "I'm sorry to have worried you." "No, Delilah hesitated, then continued with quiet determination. "I need to say this. When I came here, I had nothing. Less than nothing. I had betrayal and disappointment. You and your father gave me shelter, work, purpose. But you, Matthew, you've given me something I never expected to find in Montana." "What's that?" he asked, his voice low and rough. Delilah met his gaze. "Hope. The kind that warms from within." Something shifted in Matthew's eyes, a guardedness giving way to vulnerability. "Delilah, you don't need to say anything," she assured him quickly. "I just wanted you to know that what you did that first night, bringing warmth to someone left in the cold, it meant more than you could know." Matthew's hand moved to cover hers, his touch gentle but sure. "When I found you at that station, something told me you were meant to be here. Not just at Circle W, but with me." He paused, seeming to search for words. "I've never been a man of flowery speech, but I know what I feel. These past weeks, watching you build a place here, seeing your strength and grace, I've come to care for you in ways I never anticipated." Delilah's heart beat faster. "Matthew, you don't need to answer now," he interrupted gently. "You've had upheaval enough. I just want you to know that for as long as you wish it, I'll bring you warmth, in whatever way you'll accept it." The sincerity in his voice brought tears to Delilah's eyes. Without thinking, she turned her hand beneath his, intertwining their fingers. "I came to Montana expecting family," she said softly. "Instead, I found you." Matthew's free hand rose to gently brush a tear from her cheek. The touch was feather light, almost reverent. "May I court you properly, Delilah Dawson? With your permission and my father's blessing." The formal request, so unexpected yet so perfectly in character for this honorable man, brought a smile to Delilah's lips. "Yes, Matthew Weston. I would like that very much." His answering smile transformed his tired face, making him appear years younger. "Then I am a fortunate man indeed." As they sat before the fire, hands still clasped, Delilah felt a certainty she had never known before. The family that had abandoned her had unwittingly delivered her to where she truly belonged. In the cold of a Montana winter, she had found not just shelter, but a warmth that promised to last forever. The following weeks brought changes to Circle W that transformed the ranch from Delilah's place of refuge to her home. With James Weston's enthusiastic blessing, Matthew began courting Delilah with an old-fashioned formality that both amused and touched her. Their evenings often found them playing chess by the fire, or discussing books from the surprisingly extensive Weston library. On Sundays, they rode together to the small church in Copper Creek, their attendance noted with approving nods by the townspeople who had heard the story of how she came to the ranch. February arrived with bitter cold, but also with the first stirrings of ranch activity in preparation for spring calving. Delilah threw herself into learning everything she could about cattle operations, determined to be more than just an accountant if she was to make her life at Circle W. "You don't need to learn to rope and ride," Matthew told her one afternoon as he found her studying a manual on animal husbandry in the office. "That's what we hire hands for." "I want to understand all aspects of the ranch," Delilah replied firmly. "If this is to be my home, I should know its workings." The words slipped out naturally, but their implication hung in the air between them. Though their courtship was proceeding with mutual satisfaction, neither had spoken explicitly of marriage or a permanent future. Matthew's expression softened. "Your home," he repeated. "I like the sound of that." Delilah felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I didn't mean to presume. You presume nothing that I haven't hoped for," Matthew assured her, moving to perch on the edge of the desk. "In fact, I've been meaning to speak with you about the future." Delilah's heart quickened. "Oh, spring will be here before we know it. With calving season and then the summer drive I'll have less time for." He gestured between them. Our time together." "I understand," Delilah said, though disappointment colored her voice. "Ranch work must come first." "No," Matthew said firmly. "That's not what I meant. What I'm trying to say rather badly is that I don't want to wait until after the busy season to." He paused, seeming to gather his courage. "Delilah, would you consider becoming my wife before spring?" The directness of the proposal, so characteristic of Matthew, took her breath away. "Before spring? But that's barely 6 weeks away." "Too soon?" he asked, uncertainty flickering across his features. Delilah considered the question carefully. By the social standards she'd been raised with, a courtship of barely 2 months would be scandalously brief. Yet here in Montana, life moved at a different pace. People married for practical reasons as well as romantic ones, building partnerships to survive and thrive in a challenging land. But practicality was not what made her heart race when Matthew entered a room, nor what caused her to seek his company above all others. That was something deeper, something that had grown with surprising speed yet undeniable strength since the night he'd found her abandoned at the station. "Not too soon," she said finally, meeting his gaze. "Just unexpected. I don't need a lengthy courtship to know my feelings, Matthew." "But marriage is a serious step." "The most serious," he agreed solemnly. "And not one I propose lightly. I love you, Delilah. I think I began loving you that first night when you stood on that platform with nothing but courage and dignity despite being abandoned. I want to build a life with you to face whatever comes together." The declaration of love, spoken so simply yet with such conviction, brought tears to Delilah's eyes. "I love you too," she whispered. "And yes, I will marry you before spring." The joy that transformed Matthew's face was answer enough that she had made the right decision. He reached for her hands, drawing her to her feet and into his embrace. Their first kiss was gentle, almost hesitant, but filled with promise that took Delilah's breath away. When they finally parted, Matthew rested his forehead against hers. "I should speak with Father, make the announcement proper." Delilah smiled. "I think he might suspect already. Mrs. Simmons says he's been smiling more these past weeks than in the 10 years since your mother passed." "He approves of you," Matthew confirmed. "Says you've brought life back to Circle W. You and your father did the same for me," Delilah replied softly. When I had nothing, you gave me everything." News of their engagement spread quickly through the ranch and into town. James Weston insisted on hosting a proper celebration, inviting ranching families from miles around to share in their joy. The party, held on a clear February evening when the stars seemed close enough to touch, brought more guests than Delilah had expected. Women she'd only met in passing at church brought gifts and advice, while men clapped Matthew on the shoulder with knowing grins. "Folks have been wondering when Matthew would finally settle down," Mrs. Fletcher, the pastor's wife, confided as she helped Delilah arrange refreshments. "He's considered quite a catch, you know. Several local girls had their sights set on him." "I had no idea," Delilah admitted, feeling suddenly self-conscious. Mrs. Fletcher patted her hand. "Don't fret, dear. Anyone with eyes can see he only has eyes for you. It's a love match, plain as day." The description pleased Delilah immensely. Though she had no doubt of Matthew's feelings, hearing others recognize the depth of their connection validated her decision to marry so quickly. The wedding was set for the third Sunday in March, to be held in the small white church in Copper Creek. In the weeks leading up to the ceremony, Delilah found herself busier than she'd ever been. Between her continued work on the ranch accounts, preparations for the wedding, and learning the responsibilities she would assume as the wife of the Circle W foreman, she barely had time to reflect on how dramatically her life had changed in just a few months. One evening in early March, as she sat by the fire putting the finishing touches on her wedding dress, a simple but elegant creation of cream-colored wool, with lace accents sent by a cousin of Mrs. Simmons, James Weston, joined her, settling his large frame into the chair opposite. "That's coming along nicely," he observed, nodding toward her handiwork. "My Catherine would approve." "Thank you," Delilah replied, touched by the reference to Matthew's mother. "Mrs. Simmons has told me a little about her. She sounds like she was a remarkable woman." "That she was," James agreed, his weathered face softening with memory. "Came out west as a schoolteacher, ended up marrying a rough cattleman with big dreams and little else." He chuckled. "Not unlike you and Matthew in some ways." Delilah set aside her sewing. "I hope I can be half the partner to Matthew that she was to you." "You already are," James assured her. "I've watched you these past months, Delilah. You've faced adversity with grace and adapted to a life very different from what you knew. Catherine would have liked you immensely." "I would have liked to know her," Delilah said sincerely. James reached into his vest pocket, withdrawing a small leather pouch. "I've been waiting for the right moment to give you this. Seems tonight is as good as any." He tipped the contents of the pouch into his palm, a delicate gold ring set with a small but perfect sapphire surrounded by tiny diamonds. "Catherine's wedding ring," he explained, holding it out to Delilah. "She made me promise to save it for our son's wife. Said the right woman would appreciate its simplicity." Delilah's breath caught as she looked at the beautiful ring. "Mr. Weston James, I can't accept this." "Of course you can," he replied matter-of-factly. "You're to be my daughter in all but blood. Catherine would want you to have it." Tears pricked at Delilah's eyes as she carefully accepted the ring. "I'll treasure it always," she promised, "and strive to be worthy of it." "You already are," James said gruffly, rising from his chair. "Now I believe my son is looking for you." Something about riding into town tomorrow for final wedding preparations. After he left, Delilah sat looking at the ring in her palm, overwhelmed by the acceptance and love she had found in this family that was not her blood, but had become her heart. When Matthew found her minutes later, she showed him the ring with tears of happiness still shining in her eyes. "It suits you," he said softly, taking the ring and sliding it onto her finger where it fit perfectly. "Just as you suit Circle W and me." "My family left me in the cold," Delilah murmured, looking up at the man who would soon be her husband. "But you brought me warmth I never knew existed." Matthew's arms encircled her, strong and sure. "And I always will, Delilah. That's a promise I intend to keep forever." The day of the wedding dawned clear and surprisingly mild for March in Montana. Delilah woke to the sound of birds, the first she'd heard since winter's grip had tightened on the land. It seemed a promising omen for the day ahead. Mrs. Simmons and several neighboring women helped her prepare, filling the small back room of the church with chatter and laughter as they arranged her hair and helped her into her wedding dress. Through the narrow window, Delilah could see guests arriving, ranchers in their Sunday best, townspeople she'd come to know, and all the hands from Circle W, scrubbed and uncomfortable in clean shirts and polished boots. "Matthew hasn't stopped pacing since dawn," Mrs. Fletcher reported as she pinned a small bouquet of hothouse flowers to Delilah's bodice. "Pastor says he's never seen a more nervous groom." "Is that good or bad?" Delilah asked, surprised by her own flutter of nerves. "It's perfect," Mrs. Fletcher assured her with a knowing smile. "Shows he understands the importance of the step he's taking." When it was time, James Weston himself came to escort her down the aisle. "I'd be honored to stand in for your father today," he'd told her the night before, "if you'll permit me." Now, as he offered his arm with formal dignity that couldn't quite mask his emotion, Delilah felt only gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered as they prepared to enter the church. "Thank you," he replied simply, "for bringing my son happiness." The ceremony itself passed in a blur for Delilah. She would later remember impressions more than details, the play of colored light through the church's small stained glass window, the hush that fell over the assembled guests as she entered, and most of all, Matthew's face as he watched her approach. He looked at her as if she were a miracle, his eyes filled with such love that it nearly took her breath away. Their vows were the traditional ones, spoken with clear voices that carried to the back of the small church. When Matthew slipped his mother's ring onto her finger as a symbol of their union, Delilah felt a sense of rightness so profound it brought tears to her eyes. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Pastor Fletcher declared with evident satisfaction. "Matthew, you may kiss your bride." The kiss was brief but tender, mindful of their audience yet conveying a promise of deeper intimacy to come. When they turned to face the congregation as Mr. and Mrs. Weston, the cheers and applause that greeted them reflected the community's wholehearted approval of their union. The celebration that followed at Circle W was joyous and boisterous. Tables had been set up in the main barn, cleared and decorated for the occasion with early spring wildflowers and ribbons. There was music from local fiddlers, dancing that grew more enthusiastic as the evening progressed, and food enough to feed twice the number of guests. As tradition dictated, Matthew and Delilah circulated among their guests, accepting congratulations and blessings from everyone present. The ranch hands, usually reserved around Delilah despite her months at Circle W, approached with shy good wishes and occasionally ribald advice that made Matthew laugh and Delilah blush. "Mrs. Weston," Matthew murmured during a rare moment alone as they watched the dancing from a quiet corner. "How does it sound?" "Perfect," Delilah replied honestly, leaning into his side. "Though I'm not sure I'll ever get used to it." "You have a lifetime to practice," he promised, dropping a kiss on her temple. As the celebration continued around them, Delilah reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. From abandonment at a cold train station to becoming the beloved wife of a man who embodied all the strength and honor of the West, her path had been neither straight nor easy. Yet every step, even the painful ones, had led her exactly where she was meant to be. Later that night, After the guests had departed and the ranch had settled into silence, Matthew led Delilah to their new home, a small but well-built cabin a short distance from the main house that had been secretly prepared for them over the preceding weeks. "It's not grand," Matthew said with uncharacteristic uncertainty as he carried her over the threshold, "but it's ours. In time, we can expand it or build something larger if you prefer." Delilah took in the simple, thoughtfully furnished space, the sturdy furniture, the colorful quilts, the small piano in the corner that she recognized from the main house, and the crackling fire that welcomed them with its warmth. "It's perfect," she assured him, turning in his arms to face her husband. "Everything I could want." Matthew's hands came up to frame her face, his touch gentle but possessive. "I promised you warmth forever, Delilah. I intend to keep that promise in every way I can." As his lips found hers in a kiss that held none of the restraint of their public exchange, Delilah surrendered to the love she had found in this unexpected place, with this extraordinary man. The cold of abandonment was banished forever by the warmth of belonging. Spring arrived in earnest the week after the wedding, bringing with it the frantic activity of calving season. Delilah quickly settled into her role as Matthew's wife and a vital part of Circle W operations. Her mornings were still devoted to ranch accounts, but afternoons often found her assisting Mrs. Simmons with household management, or even helping in the barns when extra hands were needed. Evenings were precious time with Matthew, sharing the day's events and building the intimate connection of a married couple. Their cabin became a haven of peace and privacy amid the bustle of ranch life. Matthew had insisted they have meals alone at least 3 nights a week, despite his father's good-natured grumbling about missing their company. These quiet dinners became cherished rituals, times when they could shed the public faces they wore during the day and simply be husband and wife. One evening in late April, as they sat on the small porch watching the sunset paint the distant mountains, Matthew broached a subject they had discussed only in general terms before their marriage. "I've been thinking about family," he said, his arm comfortable around Delilah's shoulders. "Our family, that is." Delilah's heart quickened. "What about it? Father mentioned today that the old nursery furniture is still in the attic of the main house. Said we should consider bringing it down, seeing as how it might be needed before too long." His tone was casual, but Delilah felt the tension in his body. "Is that something you want?" she asked carefully. "Children, I mean, soon." Matthew turned to look at her, his expression serious. "Very much, but only if you're ready. I know we've only been married a short time." Delilah considered the question. Before coming to Montana, she had given little thought to motherhood beyond the abstract assumption that it would someday be part of her life. But seeing Matthew with the new calves, observing his gentle patience and protective care, had awakened a yearning she hadn't anticipated. "I would like that," she admitted softly, "to start our family, though I confess the idea terrifies me a little, having a baby so far from town from doctors." "Women have been having babies on frontier ranches for generations," Matthew reminded her. "Mrs. Simmons has delivered half the children in the county, and Dr. Wells visits from Helena monthly now, but I understand your concern." "It's not enough to stop me wanting a family with you," Delilah assured him, reaching for his hand. "Just enough to make me realistic about the challenges." Matthew's smile was tender as he squeezed her fingers. "We'll face them together, as we have everything else." By summer, Delilah's changing body confirmed that their family would indeed be growing before the year's end. The news was received with jubilation at Circle W, James Weston's weathered face breaking into a smile that hardly left it for days afterward. "A grandfather at last," he declared, embracing Delilah with careful enthusiasm. Catherine would be beside herself with joy. Pregnancy brought changes beyond the physical for Delilah. As her body adapted to nurture new life, her spirit seemed to expand as well, embracing fully the life and land she had come to love. The lingering shadows of abandonment that had occasionally haunted her receded in the face of the future she was building with Matthew. One hot July afternoon, as Delilah rested in the shade of the cabin's porch, a rider approached from the direction of town. She recognized Tom Wilson, who worked part-time at the telegraph office when not helping at his father's livery stable. "Mrs. Weston," he called, dismounting with a flourish. "Got a telegram came for you this morning. Marked urgent." Delilah accepted the envelope with a mixture of curiosity and trepidation. No one from her past knew where to find her, or at least no one who would have reason to contact her urgently. Opening the telegram, she scanned the brief message. "Delilah, have learned of your whereabouts. Thomas Dawson past Oregon Territory. March last. Left legal matters requiring your attention. Arrive Copper Creek July 20. Eliza Dawson." "Everything all right, madam?" Tom asked, noting her expression. "Yes, thank you," Delilah replied automatically, though her mind was racing. "Would you wait while I write a reply? My husband should return shortly, and I'm sure he'd want to add his regards." As Tom watered his horse, Delilah reread the telegram. Her aunt, the woman who had promised to meet her at the station, and then abandoned her without a word, was coming to Montana. The news stirred a complex mix of emotions: anger, curiosity, and a strange sense of disassociation, as if the Delilah who had been abandoned was a different person entirely from the woman she had become. Matthew returned from the north pasture an hour later to find Delilah still on the porch, the telegram in her lap. "What's wrong?" he asked immediately, recognizing the tension in her posture despite her attempt at a welcoming smile. Wordlessly, she handed him the telegram. His expression darkened as he read it. "Your uncle's widow," he said flatly, "coming here." "Why now?" "Legal matters, apparently," Delilah replied. "Though what they could possibly be, I can't imagine. My parents left nothing but debts, and I certainly had no claim on my uncle's estate." Matthew sat beside her, taking her hand. "You don't have to see her if you don't wish to." "I know," Delilah said, grateful for his immediate support. "But I think I should, not for her sake but for my own peace of mind. There are questions I'd like answered." "Then we'll face her together," Matthew promised. "And remember, whatever her purpose, she has no power to hurt you now. You're a Weston, with a family that chose you and a future secured by your own strength." The reminder bolstered Delilah's courage. By the time July 20th arrived, bringing with it the stagecoach that would carry Eliza Dawson, Delilah felt prepared for the encounter. She and Matthew waited at the small hotel in Copper Creek, where her aunt had arranged accommodations. Eliza Dawson proved to be a thin, nervous woman with faded blonde hair and a perpetually worried expression. She started visibly upon seeing Delilah, her eyes widening further at the evidence of her niece's pregnancy. "Delilah," she said uncertainly, "you look, well." "This is my husband, Matthew Weston," Delilah replied, deliberately ignoring the awkward greeting. "We're pleased you arrived safely, though I confess your telegram was unexpected." Eliza's gaze flicked to Matthew, taking in his tall, imposing figure and the protective way he stood beside Delilah. "Yes, well, perhaps we could speak privately. There are matters of a family nature. My husband is my family now," Delilah interrupted firmly. "Whatever you have to say can be said to both of us." A flush rose to Eliza's cheeks, but she nodded stiffly. "As you wish. Shall we sit?" In the hotel's small private parlor, Eliza explained the purpose of her visit. Thomas Dawson had indeed died in Oregon Territory, but not before making a deathbed confession to his wife. The money used to establish their Montana ranch, the same ranch they had abandoned, had not been his own as he had always claimed. It belonged to your father, Eliza explained, her voice low and strained. His share of an inheritance that Thomas, diverted, your father never knew. By the time Thomas confessed to me, we had already sold the Montana property and moved west. The revelation stunned Delilah. My father's inheritance, but he always said his family had nothing. Your grandfather left equal shares to both brothers, Eliza continued. Thomas intercepted the lawyer's communication to your father and forged documents to claim the entire amount. He used half to establish our ranch here, telling me it was from his savings. Matthew's hand tightened around Delilah's. And you're only revealing this now. Eliza had the grace to look ashamed. Thomas made me promise to make it right. Before he died, he signed over his remaining assets to Delilah as restitution. It's not the full amount, we lost considerable money in poor investments, but it's something. And the letter inviting me to Montana. Was that a fabrication as well? Delilah asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil of emotions. Eliza shook her head. No, that was genuine. We did intend to take you in after your parents' passing, but when we learned you were coming, Thomas panicked. He feared you might somehow discover the truth about the money, so we left me alone at a train station in winter, Delilah finished for her, with nowhere to go and no means to return to St. Louis. It was wrong, Eliza admitted, tears forming in her eyes. I've regretted it every day since. When Thomas confessed everything before he died, I promised him I would find you and make amends, however inadequate they might be. From her reticule, Eliza withdrew a thick envelope. These are the legal documents transferring ownership of property in Oregon Territory, and what remains of our banking accounts to you, Delilah. It's approximately $15,000 in total value. The amount more money than Delilah had ever imagined possessing barely registered through her shock at the entire situation. It was Matthew who reached for the envelope, his expression grave. We'll have our lawyer review these, he said, to ensure everything is in order. Eliza nodded, apparently unsurprised by his caution. Of course. I'll be in town for 3 days before returning west. If there are questions, I can be reached at the hotel. She rose to leave, then hesitated. Delilah, I know no apology can erase what we did to you. But for whatever it's worth, I am truly sorry. Thomas was as well at the end. Delilah looked at the woman who had been party to her abandonment, seeing not a villain but a weak person who had made terrible choices. Thank you for bringing the truth to light, she said formally. I wish you a safe journey home. After Eliza had gone, Delilah sat in stunned silence, processing the revelations. Matthew moved to kneel before her, his hands gently covering hers. Are you all right? He asked, his concern evident. I'm not sure, Delilah admitted. It's all so unexpected. To learn that my uncle stole from my father, that the money that might have changed our lives in St. Louis was used to build a ranch that was then abandoned. And now it comes back to me when I no longer need it. Life has strange patterns, Matthew observed. What will you do with the inheritance? Delilah considered the question. I'd like to establish a trust for our child, of course, and perhaps use some to expand Circle W if your father is agreeable. The rest. She paused, an idea forming. The rest I'd like to use to establish a school in Copper Creek. A proper one, with a paid teacher and books. Too many children here grow up without education. Matthew's smile was filled with pride. Catherine would have had the same thought. She always said education was the best gift you could give a child. Then it's settled, Delilah said, feeling a sense of resolution. Something good will come from this after all. The strange episode with Delilah Dawson soon became merely another chapter in Delilah's story rather than its defining moment. The legal transfer of assets proceeded smoothly, and by September, plans for the Copper Creek School were well underway, with a building site selected and a teacher recruited from Helena to start classes the following spring. As autumn painted the Montana landscape in gold and crimson, Delilah's pregnancy advanced toward its conclusion. The nursery in their expanded cabin was prepared, furnished with the pieces James had preserved from Matthew's childhood and new items crafted by the ranch hands, who had come to regard Delilah with protective affection. On a crisp November morning, with the first snow of the season dusting the ground, Delilah went into labor. True to his word, Matthew never left her side during the long hours that followed, his steady presence a source of strength as she brought their child into the world. "A son, Mrs. Simmons announced triumphantly as the newborn's lusty cries filled the room. Strong and perfect as his father, James Michael Weston, named for both his grandfather and father, had his mother's delicate features but his father's determined chin. As Delilah held him for the first time, Matthew's arm around them both, she felt a sense of completion that transcended anything she had ever known. "He's magnificent," Matthew whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Just like his mother." "He's a Weston," Delilah replied softly. "Born of love and choice, not just blood." As winter settled over Circle W once more, the contrast between Delilah's first Montana December and this one could not have been more profound. Where once she had been alone and abandoned in the cold, now she was surrounded by family, secure in love and cradling new life in her arms. On Christmas Eve, as they gathered in the main house for dinner, James beaming with grandfatherly pride, Mrs. Simmons fussing over the baby, and the senior ranch hands joining them by special invitation, Delilah found a moment to stand by the window, looking out at the snow-covered landscape that had become her beloved home. Matthew joined her, slipping an arm around her waist. "What are you thinking?" he asked, following her gaze. "That 1 year can change everything," she replied. "Last Christmas I had just lost my parents. I had no home, no future I could see. And now—" She turned to look at their son sleeping peacefully in his grandfather's arms. "Now I have everything." Matthew's kiss was gentle but filled with promise. "And I kept my word," he said, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "When I found you that night, I promised to bring you warmth forever." "You have," Delilah assured him, leaning into his embrace, "in ways I never imagined possible." As the Montana night descended outside, stars appearing like diamonds in the clear sky, the warmth within Circle W grew with the laughter and love of a family forged not by blood alone, but by choice and circumstance, and the courage to embrace both. For Delilah, the journey from abandonment to belonging had been completed. The cold of that long-ago night at the train station was nothing more than a distant memory, replaced by the enduring warmth of Matthew's love and the life they had built together. In the years that followed, Circle W prospered under the joint stewardship of the Weston men and Delilah's careful management. The Copper Creek School flourished, eventually expanding to include a small library named in honor of Catherine Weston. James Michael was joined by two sisters, Catherine Eliza and Sarah Grace, completing the family in a way that brought joy to everyone at the ranch. Occasionally, Delilah received letters from Delilah Dawson, who had remarried and settled permanently in Oregon Territory. The correspondence was never intimate, but it maintained a connection that helped heal old wounds and provided a link to Delilah's past that she could someday share with her children. On the 10th anniversary of their marriage, Matthew surprised Delilah with a journey to St. Louis, where they visited her parents' graves and she showed him the city where she had grown up. The trip reinforced for both of them how far they had come and how completely Montana had become their true home. "Any regrets?" Matthew asked as their train pulled away from St. Louis, carrying them back west to Circle W. Delilah considered the question seriously. Looking back on the path that had brought her to this moment, the losses and betrayals, the unexpected kindness of strangers who became family, the love that had grown from the seeds of compassion planted on a cold winter night. "Not one," she answered truthfully, her hand finding his. "Every step led me to you, to our children, to the life we've built. Even the difficult parts were necessary to the journey." Matthew's smile held all the warmth she had ever needed. "Then I'd say we found exactly where we belong." "Together," Delilah agreed, resting her head on his shoulder as the train carried them home. "Always together." And so it was, and so it remained, a love born in the cold of a Montana winter, nurtured through all seasons and warming them both forever.